When you're in between two generations, you kind of end up taking a little bit of both. And at the same time, having a little bit of understanding for both of them creates a very odd dynamic. So I'm personally between the millennial generation and the Gen Z generation. And for me, that means I do understand some of the old status quo and why it matters so much. And at the same time, I'm very adamant that things need to change and things are changing. And if you refuse to acknowledge that, you're going to get left in the dust. So, in this week's episode of Keeping Everything Simple, we're going to talk about how this little change between generations, how that transitional group is impacted by the narratives that continue, and at the same time, all the things that are to come. Let's jump right in. I really would like to be able to bridge the gap, essentially, between the generations and actively have a more productive conversation around them. Because I think for the most part, this is a role in which those of us in the micro generation, that's how it goes, but those of us that, again, fall in between two groups and at the same time kind of share ideas and traits with both of them because there's no smooth transition. For those who do generational research and these generational studies, it kind of just fluctuates as to what's defined as a generation. Some people say it's every 30 years. Some people say it's every 20. Some people say it's as low as every 15 or 10 years that there's a different generation. And it can be very hard to really overall categorize what a generation is. Now, for the most part, and this is the definition which I tend to agree with, is that, and it seems to be generally accepted, that the defining factors or the defining events that you live through in your adolescence that determine your adulthood, that defines a generation. So for millennials, some examples being living through the 9/11 terrorist attack, living through the 2008 great financial crisis, the housing crisis, and then that was them in their young adulthood going into the workforce during these times of their lives. Whereas then for Gen Z, we have post 9/11. We live in a post 9/11 world for us. We didn't experience it in a way that really impacted our adolescence and our growing up. At the same time, it was our parents that we saw within the great financial crisis of 2008 and beyond. And for us, this is where that kind of bridging the gap becomes so important because for the oldest of Gen Z, we're sitting around our mid-20s. And then for the youngest of millennials, they're sitting around their late 20s. And that, again, is just this bridging the gap opportunity that I see between us to have a good, fruitful conversation. And the first thing that comes up with this is obviously careers. And so this is the truth here that I believe is that no, if you are in my generation, you're fresh out of college, you're fresh out of high school, whatever it may be, and you've only ever had a couple summer jobs here or there where you were working retail or fast food, no, you probably should not earn a six-figure salary. Just putting that out there. And I will also then put the extra little caveat on top of this as it truly also depends on what career you're going into because it's not impossible for this to actually happen. So overall, I agree that on average, no, it's not reasonable that a fresh new graduate or someone with a very entry-level skill set wants to make six figures and believes they can do so right at the gate. But it does depend on the field you go into because, sure, someone in the field of high tech, so AI research, maybe they are in the medical field or maybe they are an entrepreneur and are joining the startup in Silicon Valley. In those instances, okay, that actually isn't out of the realm of possibility. However, I want to, again, stress that those are more so the outliers, the quote-unquote unicorns of that subset. For most of us, it's going to be starting out with those base salaries, which the thing is, I believe most of us understand. Now, the narrative consistently has been that Gen Z wants just to be handheld and that they don't understand what it actually takes to succeed in a job, but I don't think that's the case. I think for the wide majority of us, we understand that we're not going to make six figures right out of the gate. It'd be nice. It would be very nice. However, we know that there's still some work we have to put in to get to these points in which we are able to earn that salary. So Simon Sinek puts it this way. He was on the Diary of a CEO podcast, and he was talking about how the years of experience someone has in a field and industry, that also plays a big role in what their pay and salary will be. Because if you've been somewhere for 10 years, then the thing is, someone in leadership knows that you can go through the hard times and the good times and still perform the same and still do the same, if not more. And then for those of us coming into it with only a year or two of experience, if that, to say, I want to be paid the same, is understandable, but at the same time doesn't always make it reasonable, especially, again, stressing what field you go into. Because I wouldn't say for myself, if I'm going to use like an entrepreneur here for an example, I'm not going to instantly just throw all my money, if I were an investor, to the 18-year-old entrepreneur. Some instances, yes, but again, that'd be a unicorn. Versus trusting someone that has a track record of a few successful buyouts, maybe they had some good successful projects, then I'd be more inclined to say, okay, I can give my money to you because I can trust that I will get a return on my investment. And if we want to boil it down to that, it's a simple ROI question of someone that has tenure, someone that has the experience and the skill sets, they are going to give you a better ROI for the time being. If someone comes in and they only have a little bit of tenure, then it's a bit more of a gamble because we just don't know. However, you'll know in time, and that in itself is something that employers and that people that are building their careers is a risk they kind of just have to take. And even if that is the case for risk being different between employees and different tenure and whatever group you're in, the thing is that the needs today just look different. Like, things as a whole are different, whether you want to acknowledge that or not. And that doesn't mean that we're able to just do the same things over and over again and expect it to work. For someone coming out of college, and maybe they have had a job throughout high school, and maybe they were working part-time while they were university, that is a good skill set there, because that means not only are they taking initiative, they are responsible, they're able to balance their time effectively. If they're graduating from high school, college, and they're still managing a part-time or full-time job on top of workload, on top of classes, doing good, maybe they're involved still on campus, all of these factors kind of play into the overall understanding that this generation right now, so Gen Z, is the most educated and most diverse generation so far. Gen Alpha will be even more diverse than us, but for right now, we're the ones that are entering the workforce. And this plays into the fact that because there's so much diversity, there's so many things that we are bringing to the table that are new and that are different. And at the same time, the world's evolved so much where from 2008, that's when the first iPhone came out. And then to now having technology advance so rapidly and so consistently throughout the past couple of decades, past decade, and then we got 5 years till the next, I can say past couple, but that's besides the point. But having that understanding that for an employee today, they need the ability to grow and to learn, and they need different skill sets. And if we don't acknowledge that and then choose to say, hey, this is just how it's always gone, so they should know how to do this, that may not actually be relevant anymore. Certain skill sets, certain requirements that people expect of us may not actually be important. And instead, something new may be taking its place. And that, I think, is where there can be a good chance for us to bridge that conversation and say, okay, I understand why it's so important that we return to office. Like, I do. Knowing that so many connections and social capital can be built around the water coolers and breaks, that's important. And at the same time, I'm not going to deny that hybrid and remote work can be and is extremely effective if it's employed right. For so many companies during the pandemic that had to switch to online, a lot of them weren't prepared for it. A lot of them couldn't manage and handle that transition because it wasn't how their model worked. It wasn't the skills that they had developed. Whereas now it's understanding that why wouldn't someone want hybrid work? Why wouldn't someone put that as a priority and a skill set now? Because if you can work hybrid and be effective and still grow in that company and within your team, that's important. That in itself is an entirely different skill set than just doing it in person. Also, while recognizing that diversity in education is just so high within my generation, it does again continue to push this kind of conversation that needs to occur between an older generation and the newer one. Because of those differences, it doesn't just mean that we're bringing in these new ideas, we're bringing in just these new expectations. It's more so evolving what's already existed in the workplace. Because, so if I were to say like the soft skills of communication, that doesn't really differ so much between one group to the next. We want to learn how to communicate. We want to be able to effectively communicate. And to do so, we have to be taught. And for the most part, unless you distinctly go out of your way to do so, it can actually be very hard to learn how to communicate effectively, how to communicate through conflict, how to communicate when you need to be to the point or straight to the point, and then also how to like actively listen and just so many different things. And for our generation, there's a lot of emphasis on personal development and personal finance and our careers because there's a lot of stress and anxiety around it. That is an important factor to consider when having these conversations, when making these hiring decisions, when making our job decisions for where we want to go to work. Because if I'm bringing it back down to the level of education, then it's understanding with such an educated group, there is a continual understanding that things will continue to evolve. There's the understanding that it may not actually be the best decision for everyone to go to university. I support university, but at the same time, I recognize that, hey, if someone goes to a trade school, that's fantastic. We need skilled trades. If someone chooses to go the entrepreneurship route, that's also fantastic. They can get real world experience, quote unquote, right out of the gate. They can join a startup. There's so many different outlets that we have the option to choose now. And that optionality, I think, needs to be acknowledged because it can also create some kind of barriers between what someone would perceive as, okay, you now have good experience, you went to a nice university, you have your bachelor's, you have your master's, whatever it may be, but you only have 3 to 2 years of like real world work experience. Yes, that does again factor in the level of experience, level of tenure, but also at the same time does have to now factor in the level of education difference, because it used to be that the bachelor degree set you apart, that not everyone was going off to college, and so having that bachelor's was super important. And nowadays, it's understanding that for especially recruiting or finding people for work in high-level jobs, it could revolve around, hey, you have that bachelor's and that's good. Now you need a couple years of experience on top of it. Or the new option being you just need to have the corresponding amount of years of experience. So for some instances, it may be have a bachelor's and then 1 to 2 years of professional experience versus have 5 to 6 years of professional experience, because those years translate into what that degree could have been for that particular role. And this does lend itself then to the unfortunate, and I mean very unfortunate reality that we'll have some jobs that ask for that bachelor's or that master's degree and will pay barely above market price or even below, because it's just something that a lot of people do have nowadays because, again, education is so high within the current generation. And that poses a very interesting question as to what then makes such an important hiring decision, what makes such an important determining factor between education and experience. And I think that's a question that's going to continue to evolve, but combining those two together is going to be a huge, I think, benefit for groups that can do so in a more seamless manner that both validates the previous generation and at the same time gives the next generation good opportunities surrounding that level of skill and the level of education that they have. And I did mention that for companies that want employees that have been there for like 10 years, so Gen Guru, which is one of the leading firms for generational research, and especially for Gen Z right now, they've done things on like Simon Sinek's podcast and other sources as well. I think they were also on Deep Dive. I'm not totally sure on that one. But besides the point, For them, of their research, they found that 61% of Gen Z would be willing to stay at a company for 10 years. The biggest thing here is that that clashes very much so with the narrative that, quiet quitting is the trend and there is the great resignation that occurred, and not looking at the underlying causes that the new generation, people within the Gen Z cohort, want opportunities to grow. We want opportunities to hone and develop our skills. We want the ability to actually see a future that doesn't look like we're just waking up every morning and dreading going to work. Because as a whole, if you have a group that is willing to stay at a company for those 10 years, that is good retention. And at the same time, that means having to supply them with those good opportunities and that good path to development. Because if you are focusing solely on, hey, we just want to get as high productivity as possible, we'll burn out as necessary, then that leads to a very unsustainable path. And at the same time, it doesn't necessarily provide the greatest environment for someone to think, okay, I can see myself working here for the next decade. I see myself growing here, as opposed to I see myself burning out in the next year, and having that be the notion that they leave with. So having good opportunities is so important. And this is something that I believe we can all agree to, is when there is opportunities within your field, within your company, within your career, that is very motivating to say, okay, this is something that I can go down. This is a path that I can follow and feel like I'm moving forward and know that I'm moving forward. I also would say that part of that conversation does need to be understanding that finding a job fit is very important. It's less about how you could get a job straight out of high school and you could pay for your rent, you could pay for your mortgage, you could support a family off of an entry-level job that you originally had got with just a high school diploma. The world's changed and life is different. And now for us to be able to go through and say we want to stay at a company and we're willing to do so, it just requires that we feel that we can be taken care of to the extent that we can bring our best selves to work. It's understanding that having those, I would say, benefits, whether they are the literal benefits of insurance or profit sharing, whatever it may be, as well as the cultural benefits of, wow, I fit in here really well. This company actually makes me feel like I'm valued. This company actually focuses on holding true to, if their employees walked out, they would cease to exist. It's understanding that no more, gone are the days essentially of being able to again have those entry-level jobs that could support you so easily. And now it's in a time in which for a lot of Gen Z, they tend to have about 2 jobs on average, just because it helps us continue to make ends meet and live a life in a bit more of a productive manner. Because overall, for myself, I do want to be able to continue to actually grow within certain fields and certain careers. I also, and this from the last podcast, you can check that one out, I understand that there's going to be certain deviations that I'm going to take because it makes the most sense for me. And that is a change that in today's world, I think is good. It means some people may actually have shorter tenure until they land in the right spot that's a good culture fit for them, a good job fit for them, and they feel that they can stay in that role for a while moving up. And at the same time, having that conversation with our older counterparts, so the older generations in the workforce, and saying this doesn't reflect that I'm unreliable all the time. This doesn't reflect that I'm not able to complete the work. It reflects that I'm trying to find what I want to do. I'm trying to find that good fit for myself, and that should be encouraged. It should be okay to say, I want to learn and understand what this company has to offer. And at the same time, if I find that I'm not the best fit for it and I'm not the best match, that I move on and I let that spot be opened up for someone else that would be a good fit. And of course, this follows the give your 2 weeks notice, follow proper etiquette, and then don't burn bridges in the process, which again, I speak from personal experience here, that you want to do these things the proper way. But at the same time, not having that judgment and the essential bias behind, hey, if you leave after 6 months, then that's a dash on your record. And then if the next job you're there for a year and a half or 2 years, then that changes it. So having that context be part of the conversation, I think will help us understand a bit more between what one generation needs and what the other one needs, and allow us to actually be able to kind of talk about it a bit more openly. Because for me to say, I really want to work 4 days a week, because I do, it makes sense to me. And then at the same time, understanding that, I do see still the value in some fields having that 5-day work week, because that will allow them to do the right amount of work spread out over the right amount of time. But also acknowledging that, hey, the research is starting to show that the 4-day work week makes more sense. And for right now, changing that status quo to me is important, because that means life will be different for the next group after us. Because if we're able to have these conversations consistently and effectively now, then that means when Gen Alpha comes into the workforce, we're going to be able to have that conversation with them and continue that process forward and moving everything forward. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below if you're watching this on YouTube as to what you actually feel might be the best thing that Gen Z is bringing into the workforce. And at the same time, what do you think is something that really needs to stay the way it is right now in the current workforce? Because again, as I've said in the past, the only thing that is certain is that something will change. Uncertainty is probably the only thing that you can count on, because the world will continue to evolve, we'll continue to learn new things and discover what might be the better way forward. And that's something that I think we need to embrace. Well, that is it for this week's episode. So be sure to like this video if you are watching it on YouTube, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If you're listening to on a podcast app like iTunes or Spotify, be sure to leave us a ratings. It really helps other people discover the show. And again, this is a big conversation that we need to have, being able to continue to merge these two groups. And I think it's a route that we can eventually accomplish. It just requires that we both understand the context of where someone's coming from. So with that, have an amazing day, you amazing people, and go out there and do great things.